Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Winter Ag Workshop Series. I'm Cassidy. I'll be your host today. Today, we are joined by Amy Jewett, and she will be discussing the search for native and invasive species in your local natural areas. So first, we have a little bit of housekeeping. There is a pretest. The link is in the chat box. And also in the chat box, if you could drop your name, your school, and one thing you're hoping to learn, that would be great. Now your video and audio are off, so if you need to say anything, please use the chat box or the Q&A. For questions as well, feel free to drop them in. And everything is visible to everyone, so please be courteous. And with that, let's welcome Amy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Cassidy. As Cassidy said, my name is Amy Jewett, and I am the Invasive Species Coordinator at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. I've been in this role for a little over 8 years now, and I am based in the Pittsburgh region. When I work in the office, and because of COVID now for some time, I've been working out of my home primarily, which is in Southern Butler County. So I'm excited to be here tonight and to share information with each of you on native and invasive species in your local natural areas and the importance of being able to recognize these species and also to report them. So we'll go ahead and get started. So here's just a basic outline of tonight's presentation. So I'll be starting out by giving an overview of what we mean by native, exotic, and invasive species. There's also a little quiz to test your knowledge on what you already know on these topics, some data collection tools that you can use to capture data for them, resources so that you know where to go to get more information after tonight's training. And then we hope to have some time at the very end to answer some questions that you might have. Okay, so let's get started by giving an overview of native, exotic, and invasive species. And I'll preface that by saying that it's really important to make sure that you know the differences when we're talking about these different terms, because it really will impact your overall understanding of ecology and how the world around you functions, essentially. So let's start by talking about native species. What are they and why are they so important? So native species are those that naturally occur in a region, and they've evolved within particular ecosystems there and arrived without human intervention, possibly by wind, bird, or other animals. So these are species that have been here, that have originated in an area on their own. And the photos that you see here on my slide are native plants that I've actually incorporated here in my own yard. These are pictures from my own property. And the photo on the left is showing cardinal flowers. Those are the red flowers, and nodding onions. Those are the ones in the middle that have the little pink blooms. And both of those species are native to Pennsylvania. And they're really important to have because it's a food source for insects. It's providing important nectar for pollinators. And they're beautiful to look at in the summertime. I just love to go out and visit that little corner of my vegetable garden that I have these native perennials growing in. And then I also have a small meadow. You can see it's sort of in the picture on the left, a little bit farther back, past the trees, I have a little meadow growing. And in that meadow is a variety of wildflowers, including Culver's root and swamp milkweed. And these little patches in my yard are just absolute havens for insects and other wildlife. And I just love to come up and look at them in the summertime and see all the blooms and just know that these are really important parts of my yard, that I have these native plants growing in. So when we're talking about native plants, it's really important to understand that geography is key. So when you're saying that a plant is native, we're talking about, exactly where is that plant native to? So is it native to, the whole United States? Is it native to just the Mid-Atlantic region? Is it native just to Pennsylvania? Or is it even just native to just a part of Pennsylvania, like Western Pennsylvania, for example? It's also really important to understand that all plants are native to somewhere. So even though we might have some plants that are exotic or invasive in Pennsylvania and might be out of place here, they originated from somewhere else. And so they are native in some other area where they are actually living harmoniously with the other species that are in that region. But here, they might be out of place. So native plants provide the foundation for many different food webs. They are a food source for insects and other wildlife. And then that goes up the chain, the things that eat those insects or those other wildlife. And so if you don't have the native plants to feed the insects, to feed the other species and up the chain, then you don't have a healthy or functioning food web in your region. So when choosing what plants to landscape with, whether that's on your own property or maybe at your school or a local park or something like that, landscaping with native plants is always going to be your best option as much as possible. And something I like to mention, because this comes up in conversations sometimes, a lot of our native plants have in their common name the term weed. And that can be, it can give them a bad rap because people think that it's a weed, that you don't want that planted there. But it actually is a really great species to have. It's just the common name is, kind of not helping it in that regard. So things like milkweed, jewelweed, butterfly weed, sneezeweed, New York ironweed, Joe Pye weed, and pickerel weed. They all have that term in their name, but they're all native plants in Pennsylvania, and they're all really great species to have. Okay, so next we'll jump over into our non-native exotic species. So what are they and what do you need to know about them? So exotic species are those which are introduced to an area. They're able to persist, but they are not known to be invasive. They don't hinder the survival of other species within the ecosystem. They simply exist there where they have not naturally occurred. And these species can be introduced in a variety of ways. Sometimes they're human assisted, like when plants are brought in for ornamental trade, being used for medicinal purposes or possibly for agriculture. There is a lot of species in Pennsylvania that are considered to be exotic. And a lot of times we don't even realize that some of our favorite plants that we like to garden with are actually non-native exotic species. So things like tomatoes, petunias, daffodils, tulips, and hybrid tea roses. These are all exotic species. So in general, exotic species are not usable as food sources for our native insects, and they don't really provide a lot of nutritional value to our wildlife. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're trying to be ecologically sensitive as you're planting these different things. However, exotic species do contribute a lot of really important things to the environment, like storing carbon, which helps to offset the effects of climate change. They'll hold the soil, which will limit erosion, and they provide shelter that can be used as habitat by our wildlife. So some of the common names for certain exotic species, and sometimes our invasive species that we know of, can give away their origin of where they're actually native to, which can be an indicator to know if that species is native or not. So something like Japanese boxwood, we know that's going to be native to Japan or somewhere in Asia. Norway maple is a type of tree that's actually native to Europe. And Chinese wisteria, again, going to be native to that region of Asia and China. And then we have our invasive species, the ones that you want to steer clear of as much as possible. So what are they and what kind of harm do they cause? So invasive species cause harm to the environment, to our economy, and to human health, and they're always non-native. So in order for something to actually be invasive, it has to be non-native. It has to be introduced to an area and have come from somewhere else. So some examples of the problems that invasive species cause include the following. So harm to the environment. They outcompete desirable native species, decrease biodiversity, reduce or eliminate food sources for our wildlife that require specific host plants. They increase soil erosion, create low light conditions that shade out other desirable species, prevent native seeds from germinating. For aquatic invasive plants, they can decrease the amount of nutrients, dissolved oxygen, and light penetration into a water body. For terrestrial invasive vines, they can increase the weight on a tree that can lead to blowovers during storm events. As far as harm to the economy, invasive species will disrupt or threaten industries like agriculture, forestry, and tourism, reduce local property values, limit recreational activities like boating, fishing, swimming, and bird watching, And eradication and control measures, depending on what species you're talking about, can be very, very costly, sometimes even in the millions or even billions with a B, billions of dollars to manage and control some of these species. And then as far as harm to human and animal health, invasive species can negatively transform our green spaces like our local parks, which will impact our ability to recreate in those places and really lower our ability to get, have a good time, to have the well-being of being in those places. They can also trigger hay fever and other allergies, cause skin rashes or burns, eye irritation or blindness, and in some cases, even toxicity or death. So some invasive species can be ones that you really, really want to steer clear of. But again, as I mentioned before with the native species slide, it's really important to remember that the species that are invasive here in Pennsylvania are native to somewhere else. And so they're not bad plants in that regard. They're simply out of place. They've evolved in their countries of origin for thousands of years, and they've learned to adapt with other organisms that essentially keep everyone, in place, the checks and balances that, natural environment can have. And so it's only when some of these species that are considered invasive come into a new region and then are known to cause harm that then we term them invasive species. Okay, so some resources, now that we talked a little bit more about what we mean by native, exotic, and invasive, how do you learn if something is native, exotic, or invasive? And so a few of these resources I've listed here on my slide. The first one I use a good bit. It's a free online resource that you can use. It's called the Biota of North America program. It's known by its acronym BONAP. And it's a resource that you do need to know scientific names, and this is just for plants. I should clarify that. This is just for looking up the origin of plants. But you do need to know the scientific names of the species. Here I have an example for orange-eye butterfly bush, which some of you might be surprised to learn that butterfly bushes are not only non-native, but they are actually invasive species. And here we can see in our region, in the Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania, it's colored blue, and that is indicating that that species is non-native. It's exotic in that region. And the lighter blue areas that you see are actual occurrences of where that species was found in natural areas. Of course, we know that butterfly bush is a popular ornamental plant, and so certainly it's most likely in a lot of other locations on privately owned land, like people's yards and gardens. This map is primarily showing where those plants have escaped into natural areas. The BONAP program also does show you information on noxious weeds, which are indicative of something being invasive. And you can see that in the northwest corner of the country where you see some pink in Washington and Idaho. And so that's a resource that you can learn a little bit more about if you're curious if something is native or invasive in your region. And iNaturalist.org, I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through my presentation. This is another really great and free resource that you can use online. If you go to iNaturalist and type in the name of a species into their search box, again, using my example here for butterfly bush, you can see there's a little box that shows up in pink and it says introduced in the United States. And so that right there tells you that's a non-native species. It doesn't necessarily tell you that it's invasive, but it is at least going to cue you in that this is, an exotic species. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about iMapInvasives. This is the program that I administer for my day job here at the Western PA Conservancy. And so this is a great resource that you can learn specifically about species that are considered invasive in Pennsylvania specifically. So on our website at iMapInvasives.org, we do have a track species list, and you can see in the graphic there on the right, there's a variety of categories of species that you can click on any one of those. So for example, we have terrestrial plants, you can click on that and you can get a sense of the species that are generally found on land that are considered to be invasive in Pennsylvania. And that's true for all these other categories as well. So that's a really great resource to tap into. Okay, so now that we've had that overview, now let's test your knowledge and see how much you know about some of these things that we've talked about already. And for each question, there's 5 questions. For each one, just type your response in the chat box and we'll see how you do. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first question is, can you identify this particular invasive species? So go ahead and type your answers in the chat. And Cassidy, when you're ready, you can maybe talk about a few of them.
We have Bradford pear, calorie pear, flowering pear.
Okay, well, I think that we got that one. So yes, this is calorie pear, also known as Bradford pear. This is an invasive species in Pennsylvania. That might come as a surprise to some people because it is a popular ornamental species that a lot of people like to plant because of the beautiful white flowers that it has in the springtime. But it is known to escape into our natural areas and outcompete our native species, and that is why it is such a problematic invader. So good job on that one. All right, next question. Can you identify this native species? Again, we'll give folks a few moments to put your answers in the chat, and Cassidy, when you're ready, you can talk about a few of them.
We have milkweed, common milkweed, lots of milkweed.
Okay, good. Yep, you guys are on it. So this is common milkweed. This is definitely a really great native species. The photo in the top left, you can see there's a little caterpillar crawling on that milkweed plant. That is the monarch caterpillar. And this is a species that this caterpillar needs in order to mature into an adult butterfly. Without milkweed, you will not have monarch butterflies. It's that simple. And so it's really important to remember that, again, when you're planting for wildlife and for the environment, you want to make sure you're planting these native species that are the host plants for important species like our monarch butterfly. So good job. Okay, third question. English ivy and poison ivy, which one is native and which is invasive?
English ivy invasive, poison ivy native. Seems to be the same. English is invasive, poison is native.
Okay, well, you guys are on it. I'm so proud of you. So yes, that is accurate. So English ivy is definitely an invasive species in Pennsylvania, and poison ivy is a great native species. And I put that term great in there because even though many of us know that this is something that can cause, pretty severe skin rashes on humans, it actually is a really awesome plant for our native wildlife, especially birds. Birds will very often eat the berries that's produced by poison ivy, and that will help to fatten them up when they're getting ready for migration season. And it's also the leaves of this plant are consumed by other insects and wildlife. So I would actually tell you that if you have poison ivy growing on your property, if it's in an area that you don't frequent very often and you're not going to hopefully brush up against it, let it there, let it be. It's actually providing a really great environmental resource to our wildlife and to the region. Whereas English ivy is definitely invasive. It's a ground cover that will smother out other native plants that might be trying to grow. In this photo, you can see it's climbing up this tree, and as it gets bigger, the vines get a lot more heavy, and in some significant storm events, that will potentially cause enough weight to have the tree blow over completely. And that's not what we want to have happen. So English ivy is not something that you want to have on your property, nor do you want to, purposely include it. The poison ivy is actually something that's okay to have in the right places. Okay, fourth question. Which of these species were recently added to the Pennsylvania noxious weed list in 2021? And I will just give you a hint to say that of the 4 species here, 2 of them were recently added to that list.
We have Japanese barberry, calorie pear, barberry, calorie pear, barberry.
Okay, yep, you guys got it. So calorie pear and Japanese barberry were both recently added to the noxious weed list in 2021. All 4 of these species are ornamental species that are very commonly planted But now with cowrie and Japanese barberry being added to the noxious weed list, both of those have a 2-year grace period that they are going to still be able to be sold during that 2-year period of time. But at the end of that, there will be destruction orders given to nursery growers and other sellers to make sure that they are not selling that or distributing it anymore. Burning bush and Japanese spirea are considered invasive species in Pennsylvania, and they are on a list of other species that the Controlled Plant and Noxious Weed Committee will hopefully be considering in the future to actually add as additional noxious weeds. So good job. And our last question is, which of these invasive insects has not yet been found in Pennsylvania, but is one to watch for?
We have Asian longhorn beetle, longhorn beetle. Yep, lots of Asian longhorn beetle.
Okay, well, you guys have impressed me tonight. I am really excited that you know so much about these species. You are correct. Asian longhorn beetle has not been found in Pennsylvania ever, as far as we know. Hopefully it stays that way. I've actually had personal experience working with the Asian longhorn beetle eradication program in Worcester, Massachusetts for 3 years, and I've gotten to see this insect up close. Seeing the damage that it causes to trees and just the whole region where it's being found at. And this is one of those insect pests that costs in the millions, sometimes even more than that, dollars when it comes to trying to eradicate this. So it's very costly and it's very harmful to the environment. So it's not one we want to see in Pennsylvania ever. I would say though that if you ever think you do see Asian longhorn beetle in Pennsylvania, please report that immediately to the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, because we would want to know about that right away, like this instant. So we do have these other species on the slide. Spotted lanternfly and hemlock woolly adelgid are both present in Pennsylvania. And they are, I would say hemlock woolly adelgid is fairly widespread. Spotted lanternfly is about 2/3 of the way there, but they are both, unfortunately, increasing their distribution across the states. So, okay, well, great job on the test questions. I'm really impressed with everyone on that. We'll move on to talking about data collection tools. So there's a few mobile apps that I want to mention to you guys. You might know about some of them already, and maybe some of them you're not familiar with yet. But you can use them to collect data on species, both the natives and invasives and exotics that you might find in your local natural areas or your own backyard. So the first one, we talked a little bit about iNaturalist already, but I do want to mention that iNaturalist.org does have, well, of course it has the online platform, but then they have some mobile apps available for use as well. And one of their apps is called Seek. And this is a really neat tool. And I should preface to say that iNaturalist, you can use this to collect data on any species at all, plants, animal, insect, native, exotic, invasive, anything. And so the Seek app uses this image recognition software, which is really neat. And it's based on the number of observations for a certain species that's been logged into iNaturalist that essentially allows the image recognition software to either work really well or not as good as it could. So for example, red maple is a fairly common species in a lot of places. And so I would venture to say that Seek would probably always be able to easily identify red maple for you, whereas other species that might not have a lot of observations for them in iNaturalist so far, Seek might have a little bit of trouble helping you to identify that. But essentially the way it works is if you take your phone or a tablet that has the app on it out in your backyard or somewhere else, in a park somewhere, you hold the phone with the camera up to the species that you're interested in looking at and documenting, and it has these little circles that it will start to fill in on the phone that essentially is filling in the taxonomic information, again, using that image recognition software. So it's going down through kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. And when it figures out the species, that's when it's like, yep, I know what this is, and we can go ahead and document this in your app. Then you can actually upload that into iNaturalist directly if you want to. And iNaturalist is, again, if you're not familiar with this platform, it's a communal platform that a lot of different naturalists from literally everywhere, it's a global platform, are submitting data for these various species. And so you can see in the one graphic there on the top right, you know, the little red squares are showing up for where a certain species has been found across the world. And then you can zoom in on some of those areas and get a better sense of where something has been spotted. You can also use iNaturalist if you need help identifying something. People from, you know, wherever might be interested in helping you to identify something. It's just a really great resource, and I do use it a good bit. And talking again a little bit more about the iMapInvasives program. So we do offer a mobile app that you can use for collecting data specifically for invasive species. We do not track data for native species or just exotic. It has to be invasive. And this is information that we're tracking for purposes of sharing out with our online platform, natural resource professionals that are out doing management on the ground, conducting surveys, essentially really working a lot in depth with invasive species and trying to manage them. And so we do appreciate whenever community scientists or essentially people that are not affiliated with any organization, but just have that interest in nature and trying to help to report some of these species, that data is always really useful, that then goes into iMapInvasives. And so I definitely encourage teachers and other informal educators to use the iMap mobile app with your students as you would like to help to inform the data that we are providing to these natural resource professionals and other people that are really interested in that data. And so if you'd like to learn more about how to use the iMap mobile app, there was a training that I did last year for Penn State, and that was recorded, and you can go and look at that. It's about an hour long, and it actually talks about both of our mobile apps. We have two of them, but the first part of the recording does talk about this mobile app that we use primarily for our community scientists. So if you're interested in checking that out, I would encourage you to watch that recording. And just a little bit more information about iMapInvasives if you're not already familiar with it. So it is an online platform. It's map-based. And again, it's using, primarily we're using it to capture data on invasive species. So we allow anyone to sign up for free as a registered user. And from there, you can report your invasive species observations. You can also then log into the platform and view the species distributions. And all of the information that goes into iMapInvasives at some point gets reviewed by a species expert. So it's being vetted very carefully so that any data that's being shown is confirmed in iMapInvasives truly is that species at that location. We have done the work to make sure that we are presenting accurate information. That is one thing that sort of differentiates us from iNaturalist, where it's sort of a communal platform, but not necessarily experts that are going in and saying, yes, this species is this species. But with iMap, we are taking that time and that due diligence to make sure that anything that's confirmed, we're pretty confident that that is that species. So for managers who are doing work with invasives, they're able to record their treatments and track their success efforts. There's also email alerts that anyone can sign up for if you're interested. So if you want to keep tabs on where certain species might be getting found, you can set up an alert for that. Or if you're interested in a certain geographic area, you can, hone in on that place and then be alerted when something gets reported there. And then also the platform does provide useful data summaries and reports, and also allows people to conduct more advanced survey efforts and to catalog that in the platform. So it does a lot of different things. It's a little bit more advanced than iNaturalist in what it can do, but it is really beneficial, and it's starting to become more widely used across Pennsylvania as the program continues to grow. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more about some resources that might be valuable to you as teachers for your students to learn more about what we're talking about here with native and invasive species. So the first thing I want to highlight, I just love this brochure. I think it's so awesome. It was made by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DCNR, and it highlights a variety of species that are native to Pennsylvania. And it talks about the site conditions that they grow best in. So if you're interested in planting some native species, it's really important to know where they will do well in, because some species, they require those sunny, dry locations. They don't want their feet wet. And other ones are the exact opposite. They want to be in the shade and they want to be wet all the time. So how do you know which ones do well in these locations? Well, this brochure is going to help you to figure that out. It will also give you information on the size of how big or small a plant tends to get, and then other notes about it, like if it's an evergreen, does it produce fruit or nuts, is it fragrant, that sort of thing. So it's a really nice brochure. It is available on the DCNR's website under their Landscaping with Native Plants section. And they also came out recently with these fact sheets, which again, I'm a big fan of, and they're very similar to the brochure, but they kind of have some additional information that the brochure doesn't have. So there's some additional species that they highlight, and then you can see there's these little categories with these little squares in them that highlight some additional details about the species, like what they can do. Does it attract birds? Is it fragrant? Is it deer resistant? Is it edible by people? Those sorts of things. So again, they have a fact sheet for each one of those site conditions. So the sunny moist, sunny dry, shady moist, and shady dry type of sites. So these also are available online on the DCNR website, again, under their Landscaping with Native Plants section. These two tools I cannot talk enough about. I just love them. They are so awesome and they're super easy to use. So if you want to know what plants are native to your region, go to either of these sites and all you have to do is enter your zip code. That's it. And it will spit out a list of species that are native specifically to your region. So if you remember, we were talking before about geography is key when you're talking about native species. If something is native just to Pennsylvania, it might actually not be native to the whole state. So here with these tools, you can really hone in on what species are truly native to your exact region. And those tools are offered by the Audubon Society and also the National Wildlife Federation. They both have these native plant databases and plant finders that you can figure this out very easily. And so here are some screen captures of some of the information that you'll get if you're using the Audubon's tool specifically. You can see I got two species here. I put in my zip code, trumpet honeysuckle and pitch pine, two of many species, I should say. It's not giving you just two, but it's giving you a whole big list, probably hundreds of species. And these are just, examples here of a tree and a plant, but they also give you information on annuals and perennials, grasses, succulents, shrubs, trees, vines, and evergreens. You can also sort by whether these species provide nectar, fruit, nuts, seeds, they're food for butterflies or food for caterpillars. And because it's the Audubon's tool, they of course are going to give you information specific about birds. So if you want to see a specific bird in your property, you can do that and figure out the type of plants that you need to incorporate into your landscape that you know that certain birds are attracted to. And then also it gives you the ability to filter by keyword if you're looking for specific plants that you have in mind. And here's some screen captures. The first one here is from the National Wildlife Federation. This is just, again, giving you information once you put in your zip code, some of the plants that it will give you. And again, this is just one example. It gives you a whole variety of species. Again, plants, trees, shrubs, the whole works. And so here, this is really honing in, not necessarily on the bird component, that was Audubon, but here it's really focusing on the species of butterflies and moths that will use particular invasive plants, or I'm sorry, particular native plants as their host plant. So again, thinking back to one of our test questions with the milkweed and the monarch caterpillar needing that milkweed, some other species of insects and other things require something like this hibiscus in order to mature into an adult. And so without it, that will never happen. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that we're providing these specific native plants in our yards and gardens to allow these insects to mature into adulthood. And so here's just another example of another plant that came up from the National Wildlife Federation that would be native to my region. It's a type of serviceberry. Again, you can see down near the bottom the species of moths and butterflies that will use that as a host plant. So it's really, really interesting. I could spend probably hours of my time on here just researching and understanding more of which plants are the hosts to these different and really interesting too to see that if you planted some of these things in your own yard or garden or at your school, to then see if you're finding some of those caterpillars or butterflies later on. So that might be a little food for thought if that's something you want to test out later on. So I want to talk to you about some field guides that are really great resources, primarily for older youth or adult learners. And these are all about learning about invasive species from Pennsylvania or in our region. These guides are all available online for free, so you can access them anytime. The first one is called Invasive Plants of Pittsburgh. And as the name implies, it's going to be mostly relevant to Western Pennsylvania. But a lot of the species that the field guide covers are things that are found throughout Pennsylvania. So it's still a really great resource to have, even if you're not from the Pittsburgh region. The next one, the Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas, is not just Pennsylvania, but it is our region here in the Mid-Atlantic area. And it's highlighting a variety of invasive species that are known to be present here. The very back portion of this field guide is nice because it has information on native alternatives. So if you have some of these invasive plants that are growing in your yard or garden and you want to replace them with something else, it will give you that information. So if you have an invasive tree, it's going to give you information on native trees that you can plant. Same thing with other types of plants and shrubbery and that sort of thing. So it's a really great resource. And then the other two field guides are created by Pennsylvania Sea Grants in conjunction with Penn State. And they're both talking about aquatic invasive species primarily. One is focused mostly on Pennsylvania and the other has kind of a wider range where it's talking about the Mid-Atlantic region. And so those are really great resources to use as well if you're curious to learn about some species that are more in the aquatic realm that are invasive. And for the younger learners that are out there, for any teachers from elementary school or even kindergarten age, I love this book. I actually have it. I have a young daughter, and so this is one that I would definitely recommend for young children. It's a great introduction to what invasive species are. What are we talking about when we say invasive species? And a lot of times, youth don't get to know about invasive species until later on because it's sort of a complicated and complex topic. But this sort of breaks it down and just makes it a little bit easier to understand. So this book is called The Pests That Girdle the Home of Tucker the Turtle. I just love that title. I think it's so cute. And it's essentially telling the story of Tucker's home and how he starts to see it change over time and all these new things come into his home and start to crowd out things, or these strange critters that he's never seen before start to come. And so it's just highlighting specific invasive species and the way that it's written. It kind of rhymes and it's neat. It's a really good introduction to invasive species for young children. And on YouTube, I would definitely recommend you check this out. The Game Commission, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, recently did a recording for someone reading this book. So you can actually play it in your classroom if you prefer to do it that way. But either way, I definitely recommend checking out this book if you haven't already. So some resources that are available specifically from my organization with the Western PA Conservancy. Last year, we did a special webinar training and we updated our website with information that we are categorizing green isn't always good. And as you can probably guess as far as what that's referring to, we were talking about invasive species and how a lot of times the greenery that you might see in your local natural areas or your parks might not be a good plant. Maybe it's something that's causing harm in those areas. And so we have information on our website on 10 fairly common invasive species in Pennsylvania, talking a little bit more about how to identify them and also information on the native alternatives that you can use to replace them with. And the recording, the training that we did last year is available online to watch. So if you'd like to check that out or show that in your classroom, that is a resource that is available to you. Both of them are resources that are available online. Okay, so this is an awesome film. I just recently learned about this. It was newly released in November of last year. It's called Uninvited. And this is, I would definitely recommend using this in your classroom, absolutely. It talks about the spread of invasive species in New York State, and talks about the people and the organizations who are trying to do the work to mitigate the spread of these species and try to slow them down and hopefully even eradicate them in some situations. So I do have a short clip of the film that we can watch here so that you can get sort of a taste of what the film is all about.
The natural world is complicated. The water, weather, plants, animals, all are influenced by countless variables over millions of years to help guide their behavior. And what we do know is, for the most part, living things are a product of their environment. They've evolved over time with the species around them. They know the rules, they know the players, and they found ways to coexist. When an invasive species comes into play, things change.
When we think about introduced species that arrive somewhere, we're often worried about that they break the rules of the game. The checks and balances that you have is being broken by species that arrive without their suite of natural predators or diseases. So then they can outcompete a lot of the native species, become super abundant, and create ecological or economic problems.
The big problem with invasive species, particularly invasive plants, their definition, by definition, they are non-native plants. So they're coming from someplace else, which means any of the insects here, I've never seen them before, that they don't have the adaptations to be able to get around their particular chemical defenses. The other part of the definition of an invasive plant is that it's aggressively displacing native plants. So you have a plant, and around here it's typically from Asia, from China, that is aggressively pushing out the plants that are now supporting the wildlife around us. So they look like plants, they look like they're contributing to the local ecosystem, but almost nothing can eat them.
So there's lots of different ways that invasive species can end up here. You know, of course, there's a lot of unintentional hitchhikers that maybe, you know, come over on a cargo ship or come over on the wooden pallets that are holding a lot of our goods. But there's also a lot of intentional introductions. You know, we might order these in over the internet. You might want like a new tropical fish or some interesting aquatic plants for your aquarium, for example. But what happens when you can no longer take care of it or you need to move? In many cases, a lot of times these get dumped into a local water body. Now you've introduced a new fish species or a new plant species that can easily take over because that lake or that water body is not adapted to that new species.
Okay, so that was just a short clip of the film. I wish I had more time to show you more of it, but hopefully you'll get a chance to watch that on your own after the training tonight. Just talking a little bit more about some other resources that are available for invasive species in particular that are great for use in your classrooms. My program, the iMapInvasives program in Pennsylvania, we put out a newsletter generally about 3 times a year, and we talk about a variety of stories where people are doing work related to invasive species mitigation, research, you know, surveys, student involvement. And a lot of times these stories are not heard about or told about any other way. And so we really like to highlight them in our newsletter. And they are available, all of our archived newsletters are available on the iMapInvasives.org website. So if you're interested in checking them out, they are available there. And then one of the things that we try to do so that if you have questions or want to learn more about a particular story, there is the option to click on a button within the newsletter and actually email the author. So if that's something that you'd like to do, that's certainly something that's available to you. One of the stories that I'll just mention that's relevant to our teacher audience here tonight, that was featured in our newsletter previously, was a story of some college students from Allegheny College, and they teamed up with the French Creek Valley Conservancy to survey for invasive species that were on a property that was owned by the Conservancy. And they essentially did that for purposes of creating a management plan for the French Creek Valley Conservancy. And then from there, the Conservancy was able to use that management plan to understand what invasive species were on the property, where they were located, and they were able to use that to then actually go in and do management. And the photo here on the left is showing some of the students from Allegheny College as they're out surveying. And the photo on the right is showing some volunteers with the French Creek Valley Conservancy as they're trying to restore the property. As you can see, there's a tree tube there that's got a young tree seedling growing in it. And that's in an area where garlic mustard and knotweed were removed, which are both invasive species. So really cool story, really great partnership between this college and this land trust, and a win-win in both situations where the Conservancy is getting help to do this type of work, and the students are getting this really great experiential learning where they get to actually do this stuff themselves in person. So this is another great resource. Again, I would definitely recommend using this in your classrooms if you're able to. This is called a film called Hometown Habitat, and it's all about the importance of planting native species, which we've talked about a lot tonight. This is just another really engaging resource that really helps to tell that story really, really well. Doug Tallamy is featured, as you saw probably in the Uninvited film. He is very much featured in Hometown Habitat. He is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware, and also a renowned author of several books, one of which is Bringing Nature Home, again, talking about the importance of planting native plants. And so Catherine Zimmerman is the producer of this film. There's a website if you're interested in learning more about this film. It is available for purchase. The DVD set is available online at the Meadow Project. It's about $30 to purchase that. There is a free trailer that you can watch on YouTube. It's about 3 minutes long, so you can sort of get a sense for what the film is all about. There are also virtual screening options as well. Again, if you're interested in that, you'll go to the Meadow Project online. And there also was a podcast, I happened to come across this recently, that was an interview with Catherine Zimmerman about her film, Hometown Habitat. So both of those are available on YouTube if you'd like to check them out. Okay, so I'm almost wrapping up my presentation here. I only have a few more slides left. And I want to wrap up by talking about how you can incorporate some of this information and this knowledge into your classrooms that are specific to the grades that you're teaching and the children that are in your classrooms. So for elementary education, you might consider planting a native wildflower garden at your school. And maybe some of you have done that already, which is fantastic. And if some of you maybe have considered it, now might be a great time to pursue that. It's a really great opportunity to teach your students about the importance of native plants, looking for those pollinators and important insects that are attracted to our native plants. And it really just gives them that experiential learning of getting their hands in the ground and watching something grow. That's a really, really awesome experience, I think, for most children to get to do. You might also try, for elementary school students, raising and then releasing monarch butterflies, but getting them as caterpillars and allowing the students to, see that caterpillar kind of grow up and, go into its little cocoon and then eventually become a butterfly. And so if you're doing specific, to the monarch butterfly, talking about the importance of milkweed, or if you have a different species of butterfly, talking about the importance of whatever host plants that butterfly needs, or that caterpillar needs, I should say, to mature into a butterfly. So that, I think, would be another really great opportunity to include into your curriculum with your students. For older kids that might be in middle or high school, there's an event that I've done that I've worked with our education coordinator at the Western PA Conservancy on developing kind of an informal curriculum, and it's called the Native and Invasive Species Scavenger Hunt. And the idea is to gather a list of species, and maybe you choose like 15 or 20 that are both native and invasive, and create a type of search. So you're going out to your local park or maybe even somewhere on your own school property and searching for these species and seeing if you can find them. And if you do, to report them, to iNaturalist, to iMapInvasives. Certainly with iMap, you're only going to be reporting the invasive species. With iNaturalist, you could report everything that you're finding. Again, that's that really great opportunity to get people and your students out doing this themselves, really, getting a better understanding of plant identification, the habitats where some of these species are generally found in, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot, that could be incorporated into something like this. And it sort of depends on how far you want to take it, but it could be a really great opportunity for, I think, a lot of students to get to do something like this. And I would just wrap up by saying that if you did want to do something like the scavenger hunt, something that would be really important to talk about when you're having your students get more involved in this is the importance of picture taking. So if you're reporting your findings, you want to make sure that good pictures are being submitted to the platform that you're giving that information to, like iNaturalist or iMapInvasives. So the photo on the left here is showing a purple loosestrife plant. And this photo is really great. It's close up, where can see the plant really well. It's clear, it's crisp, it's really good. The other two photos are not as good. We can see the photo in the middle of Mila Minute Vine is kind of fuzzy. It's not as good for identification. You can still probably make it out, but it's not as good as it could be. And the other photo on the far right is not at all what we need to make an identification of this plant. It's too far away. It's not showing us these distinguishing characteristics that we need to see. And it's also a little fuzzy as well. And when I talk about distinguishing characteristics, that is also a really important thing to keep in mind, that when you're taking pictures of plants in particular, but also insects as well, you want to make sure that you have a general understanding of how to identify that plant and then take pictures of those specific things. So here's an example with Tree of Heaven, which is an invasive tree. And as you can see on the far left, if you look at each of the individual leaflets on that, the leaf, there is a little notch near the base of each of those leaves. That is unique to Tree of Heaven. If you would turn that leaflet over, you can't see it too well. I should have circled it on my picture here. But there's these little glands that are on near the notches on that leaflet. And that is also a distinguishing characteristic of Tree of Heaven. That's actually where Tree of Heaven, some of you might be familiar, it gives off a really bad smell. And those glands are where that comes from. It also has a very unique bud scar, as you can see here on the remaining photo. And the bark of Tree of Heaven is sometimes referred to or compared to the skin of a cantaloupe. And so again, if you're taking pictures of the bark of this tree, that's going to help other experts who are looking at your pictures to correctly identify and make sure that that is, indeed Tree of Heaven. Okay, so that wraps up my presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone has, or just listen to any comments that folks might have as well. So thanks so much for your attention tonight.
You can go ahead and drop any more questions. We do have a couple already. For one, is there a site where the books that you mentioned are located, or where would you find them?
Yeah, so all the field guides that I mentioned are available on the PA iMapInvasives website. We have a section, I believe it's under resources, called publications. So you can access all of them there. And I will be sharing a PDF version of my PowerPoint after tonight's training is over. And there are links to each of the field guides that will be embedded in the PowerPoint, that you can access them that way as well.
Perfect. Another one. Someone heard that spotted lanternfly could feed on milkweed. Is that true?
I know it has a lot of different host plants. I don't know off the top of my head if milkweed is one of them or not. I think it has like 60 or 70 host plants. It really loves tree of heaven. That much we know of for sure. So I can't say for sure whether or not milkweed is one of them. I would definitely recommend the answer to that is probably on Penn State Extension's website. They have a lot of really great information about spotted lanternfly, including the species that it will feed on. So I would definitely recommend checking out that website.
Interesting. We also do have a comment that spotted lanternfly loves shaggy birch trees as well.
Interesting.
Will calorie pair come back if you cut it down?
I would say it has a very good chance. Yes. It's one of those things which is true for a lot of invasive species that you need to remove the entire root system to make sure that it will never come back. There is information, again, I want to point to Penn State Extension. They have a lot of really great resources specifically talking about management for specific invasive species. And I'm not an expert in management, so I don't want to say that I am and start, giving all this information that I'm not completely sure about. So I'll point you to Penn State Extension. They have a lot of great resources on how to manage some species and what to expect and, that sort of thing. There are other places as well, but that's one that I typically reference fairly often myself for management type questions.
Great. What happens if a noxious weed or another plant that Pennsylvania bans continues to be sold in another state and then is brought into Pennsylvania?
That is an interesting question. So there are, so for example, with barberry, that's now a noxious weed, and in 2 years it will officially be banned from being sold. So if it wasn't banned in a state, I don't know exactly if it's banned in Ohio or not, I'm just going to use that as an example, but if someone purchased it in Ohio, technically they could bring it back and plant it in their yard. Now, obviously, I would not recommend doing that because we know it's an invasive species and it's been added as a noxious weed, but there wouldn't necessarily be anything stopping you from doing that. But again, just knowing that that's not a good plant to be purchasing.
That makes sense. And then, are you teaching or do you know anything about how to forage and harvest edible invasive plants as a way of getting rid of them?
So I am not an expert on that topic. I have eaten some meals that included invasive species. I believe I had a garlic mustard soup and a knotweed, a sandwich that had knotweed in it. And it wasn't bad, actually. But there are other resources out there. I don't have any at the top of my head that I can tell you about, but I'm sure if you did some research online, you could find some places that have more info about that. Unfortunately, I don't have much more info to give you about it, but it is a way that people are trying to manage these species in sort of a more creative way is by eating them. And they actually do that with some invasive fish species as well that I know of.
That's interesting. The last one is actually a comment. They said they use iNaturalist all the time and participate in the Western PA versus Eastern PA competition.
Awesome. That's great to hear.
Looks like those might be all of the questions we have. I'll just quickly say that we will send out the resources folder. You'll get a Zoom email tomorrow with a link to that, and that'll include Amy's resources sheet. And then we will also send it out again on Saturday, so watch your email. And with that, Amy, do you have any last things you would like to say?
I just would thank everyone again for tuning into the presentation. And my contact information is here on the slide. Folks can feel free to reach out to me through email or phone if they have any follow-up questions. I do trainings, for folks that request that. So if that's something that you'd like, we can, talk more about maybe setting something like that up. But yeah, happy to stay in touch with anyone that might want to, have more information provided to them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your information.
Yeah,
And
thank you.